So Shooter Breeze topic number 2 tonight says another video speaking of black Seminoles in Red Bay's Andros, the Bahamas. Attended an exhibition where Dr. Dunn expounded on his research and visit to Red Bay Andros. So this came with a link as well. Let's check it out.
It's the 1850s. The Fugitive Slave Act has just passed, and slavery is in full swing in America. And Harriet Tubman, born into slavery, is leading expeditions from the northern free states into the South, then rescuing enslaved people through covert missions back up north. It was known as the Underground Railroad, but it was neither an actual railroad nor was it underground. And while you may have learned about this northern route in school, there was an alternate route that enslaved people used to escape slavery many years before.
Why was there a need for a southern route on the Underground Railroad?
Well, the Southern Underground Railroad is something we knew very little about until recent times, and we're continuing to learn about it, and it's very exciting as an historian.
A lot of slaves who lived in the far south, Georgia, for example, coming to Florida was a shorter route than trying to get all the way north to Ohio or to Canada.
Florida's this no man's land. It's a refuge for Seminoles, enslaved people, people fleeing the law in the southern United States and elsewhere.
Florida was a wild place. There was probably very little policing, law enforcement in Florida. There were Seminole Indians in Florida, and black escaped slaves often joined with them and were helped along the way. And then there were Bahamians in Florida along this coastline, Bahamian fishermen. And often the slaves using the southern route would be helped by Bahamian fishermen who would take them to the Bahamas and to freedom.
We are right now seated just 50 miles from Bimini, which is part of the Bahamas, not too much farther away from Andros Island. I bring that up because Andros was the key refuge for these enslaved people who made it across.
One of the problems that southern planters had was that slaves who were so close to Florida, particularly in Florida, was under the control of the Spanish up until 1821. There was really no getting these slaves back. The Spanish welcomed them into Florida. They saw these escaped slaves from Georgia and the Carolinas as a bulwark against the Americans who were moving into this region and wanted to take control of Florida.
For a Southern Underground Railroad to work, you needed assistance beyond the Spanish simply willing to permit escapees to pass through. While some indigenous tribes aided in the escape efforts of the Southern Railroad, others sought to capture and return enslaved people in exchange for weapons and other forms of payment. You also needed navigational assistance and supplies. Florida was raw, undeveloped, but it did have various waterways and long unprotected coastlines. Along this path is where the enslaved blacks would be introduced to their most likely collaborators, Florida's black Seminole population.
The black Seminoles were not people who were racially mixed with Indians. The black Seminoles were people who intermarried with the Seminoles or camped or encamped themselves near the Seminoles and then joined an alliance, an agreement with the Seminoles to fight whites coming into Florida, the army in particular, to remove the Indians from Florida.
I think that eyewitness account says there were as many as 60 enslaved people and 60 black Seminoles who were grouped down here, foraging for food, waiting for whatever vessels might come from the Bahamas to rescue them and take them out of the United States.
The nearly 500-mile journey to get to the southern tip of Florida and its many obstacles would prove to be just one part of this quest towards freedom. Once down here along Key Biscayne, escapees would have to coordinate the final leg of this arduous journey to get to places like the Bahamas. But why risk your life crossing the Atlantic Ocean after making it this far?
The attraction for the Bahamas and some other areas was that they were under the control of the British, and slavery had been abolished in England. So blacks in this country saw England as a place of freedom, because once you got there, you could not be enslaved. That was part of the appeal.
We do have an account of some enslaved people getting into what today we would call a dugout canoe and somehow negotiating these waters, which is beyond me.
Without any of the modern day tools of maritime navigation and with limited assistance, nearly 1,000 enslaved escapees braved these waters of the Atlantic in hopes of reaching the Caribbean islands. This southern route was alive and well many decades prior to Harriet Tubman and the Northern Railroad movement. But whatever became of these escapees once they reached this island of freedom?
The place where most of the escaped slaves settled in the Bahamas was called Red Bays. It's on Andros Island. It's the closest point of land between Key Biscayne and the Bahamas. A Black Seminole community established itself at Red Bays. It still exists today. It's still unique. It's the most Africanized settlement in the Bahamas today.
The human quest for freedom is so strong that a human seeking freedom will try anything she or he can to gain freedom. And this was a great example, coming all the way down the center of this vast peninsula. I mean, it's so long, it's unreal. And then the final trek, somehow getting across these waters to a place that recognizes freedom and is not going to send you back.
This nearly impossible pathway to freedom came to an abrupt end once the U.S. purchased Florida from Spain in 1821. Florida quickly became a typical southern state that established a slavery-based economy, and the U.S. military was brought in to crack down on the escaped blacks here, along with their Native American collaborators.
So Florida was, in a sense, an armed camp when we became a state. And the reason for that was to get the Indians out of Florida, to recapture escaped slaves, and to have white domination of Florida become a reality. And it worked very well.
Once it becomes American, that really means the end of this railroad. So it was long-lived with very scanty numbers, and we have just a bare bones understanding of it. But it's such an important chapter in our history. And you can see how different it is from the Northern Underground Railroad.
Interesting stuff, right? A lot of folks won't know that history, that connection, and I wonder what the ADOS FBA types are thinking when they hear that. Kevin Carre, did you know of that history, and what do you think of it now that you're seeing it?
Yeah, this is the first time I've heard about it. I'm like, wow, that's amazing. But what you said, with the FDA and the ADOS, they're gonna deny it. Like, oh, those are not people. You see, they ran away. Those are not Americans. We stood here and fought. But as I said, to risk your life to come down from those slave states to come through Florida, you're still risking, going through, the wildlife and starvation just to get to the Bahamas. It just says a lot about our people. We're just when we put our minds to something, we determined to get it done. We're gonna get it done.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Caesar, again, thanks for coming through and joining the panel tonight. Caesar, were you familiar with this history? And if not, what do you feel about it after seeing that video?
Yeah, I was not familiar with this history. It was fascinating. My thoughts on it, why I liked it. I mean, this is a great example of, African American slaves going to the Caribbean. So technically these people would be, ADOS / FBA, right? They might not be happy about that though, but it's quite interesting. Yeah.
Full disclosure, Caesar, I don't know if you know this, but myself, Mr. Untouchable, Daily Affirmation by Pauline, we're all from the Bahamas too. So.
Oh wow, that's cool. Okay.
Yeah. Matron, what did you see here?
I saw another piece of history that is a family story of mine that's been passed down coming to light. I have heard this history before, and Dr. Claude Anderson also talks about the southern route of the Underground Railroad. I knew we were all cousins. I don't know why we don't always know that we're all cousins.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dr. Clark talked about it too. Achieve Mindset is in the chat. I haven't seen the brother Achieve Mindset in a while. In fact, I haven't seen Achieve Mindset this early in a while. He's over in the UK. He said the dude needs to stop with our history. He says they did not fight. What war did they fight? So he's talking about the ADOS FBA, who always talk about they stood up and fight. You know, they stood up and fought white supremacy, like Kevin Carray pointed out. No, some of y'all fled and became, you know, became Bahamians, right? Became Caribbean. Carray, you want to say something?
I'll hold on. I'll speak after everyone's done. There's something I want to add to that. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, all right. In the chat, the Forecast Radio says in a letter to Andrew Jackson during the Seminole Wars, a general said, "I can assure you, this is a Negro war." Right? You guys could join the panel, man. Click the link. Let me drop the link again in the chat. Anyone who's in the chat who wants to join the panel can join. The more the merrier. The beauty of Shoot the Breeze is that it's a diversity of thought, not just people. So by all means, you guys can click the link and hop on. Mr. Untouchable, you're from the hometown, from Nassau. Did you know about this history?
Yeah, certainly. I they have a book on it. I forget who the author is, as far as the Seminole Wars and the slaves. Well, what they consider to be the Seminole Wars, it was the black slaves fighting against Andrew Jackson those, and it's a good book on it, man. I just saw it at the bookstore the other day, because what's interesting is the people on my father's side is from Andros.
Okay.
They from Mangrove Key, so we know about Red Bays from a long time ago, long time ago. But what also is interesting is that this is just a portion of the story, though, because not only did the slaves in the southern Florida areas coming running from the Atlanta and into Florida and Florida Keys, go to the Bahamas, they also went to other islands in the Caribbean as well. In particular, Haiti. You know, who was offering freedom from
if you could reach.
If you could reach there, how many people you know how people are, you know, how many people are would have taken up that task to try to cross over to get into Haiti? They if they went in all the way into Canada, certainly they would have tried to see if they could pass a couple of miles of water to get into Haiti, certainly. And I don't think that that's necessarily talked about, because these people, when they have these ADOS arguments, if these people were a part of the institution of slavery in the Americas, and then they fled and went to the Caribbean, if you fast forward that maybe 400 years later, and now you see the families of these people coming back to the United States of America, aren't these people still your family members? So the whole argument of they are not us, it becomes ridiculous. It becomes so ridiculous. But because people don't necessarily have a historical reference, you make these kinds of arguments. Because I mean, if you listen to the Gullah Geechee, people of South Carolina, I mean, they have an accent and parlance, everything. So it's just almost sometimes it's just ridiculous to have these kinds of arguments. But I understand that the people don't necessarily have the best cultural referencing sometimes.
Right.
So they come up with these ridiculous kinds of arguments. But we one big family. That's just what it is. That's what I believe.
Yeah. But before I go to Kevin Carray, Mr. Untouchable, if I ask you about the surname Hezekiah, what would you say? As a Bahamian, what would you say?
Hezekiah?
Yeah.
Well, I know Hezekiah's. I know Hezekiah's, man. If you could name it, I could tell you the island. Hezekiah sound like an Andros name, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I think it's an Andros name.
Yeah, Hezekiah sound like an Andros name.
Just like Roll is an Exuma.
Roll is an Exuma name.
Yeah.
You could place people in the different islands when you hear the last names. You know? So,
Allen is a Lutra.
Allen is a Lutra.
You know.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah. So like, shout out to Lutra too, by the way.
Yeah,
Um,
Lucha.
but the reason why I asked you that question, I used to do a book club, right? The Bill
Yeah.
Medicine book club with a guy named Carl Hezekiah, who lives in Florida. And I said to Carl, Carl, you need to look in your family history because that name, that's a big behavior.
Yeah, man. Yeah, man. It's all you gotta do. But the people don't really. We just getting into the whole science and DNA and all these kinds of things. But sooner or later, more and more people can start to realize that we are closer family members than we really considered before. I mean, it's ridiculous because you would do a DNA test and discover that you have family members in America and never been to the Americas before.
Yes.
I have to ask the question, why is this?
Yes.
So, like I say, we a big family, very big family. We have our differences, of course, because of the time that's involved in the separation. Our experiences may have been different, but I could assure you we are one big family from West Africa.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that, Mr. Untouchable. Kevin Carey, you wanted to add something?
Sorry about that. Yeah, my computers are kind of acting up. Yeah, I want to add something too. Remember, in the early part of the 20th century, a lot of people, Black Americans, left and fled to Europe because of what was going on. Well, it was like a big race war where the blacks and the whites were just going at each other. One of the big famous one that fled was Josephine Baker. I don't think she ever came back to the United States though.
Right, Josephine was the dancer, the entertainer out there in France. I think she did come back for the civil rights movement. I think she was a part of that when it happened. But she mostly, for her adult life was spent in France. In the chat, Keto says, so true to Mr. Untouchable. Speaking of us being one kind of big family in reality, man. We're just one set of West African people for real. And when we realize